out here to share his knowledge about Mount Auburn Cemetery. And he's going to talk a little bit about its role in the Garden Cemetery movement and some notable people from the Unitarian Church that are buried there. John has been a member, or has started in the church in 1995 with his wife, Teresa. And he has, in 1 month, he will have been in the senior choir, the weekly senior choir, for 25 years. Is that correct, John?
Yeah. Hi, Kat.
Isn't that great? And he recently, in 2021, took over as parish historian from Jim Lanfrey. Plus, he's done a lot of other things. Those are just a couple to point out. Anyway, we're very happy to have you here and excited to see and hear about the cemetery.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, shall we jump in then? I'm going to actually ask Mark to do the honors with the slide presentation. And so can everybody see and hear? Just to check.
Yes.
Okay.
Can
All
we
right.
ask everybody to mute themselves?
Okay.
Yeah. And I have about 40 slides. I'm hoping to do this in less than 45 minutes, so we'll have a chance to chat at the end. The focus today is both a general introduction to the cemetery and a particular focus on our church's founding generation. That would be, for the most part, members who were present in the late 1850s when the church was called together, called its first minister, Amos Smith. I will be also mentioning a couple of other later members who are buried in the cemetery. But why don't we just jump right in? To give an overview of the presentation, Mark, you can go to the next slide. So we'll talk just briefly about the origins of the Garden Cemetery movement and specifically the history of Mount Auburn. I have a few slides highlighting the beautiful nature, some of the architecture and notable funerary monuments there. We could go on all morning about notable residents here, if you could go back, Mark, notable residents of Mount Auburn, but although it is a non-sectarian cemetery, it has historically been associated especially with Unitarians and to some extent Universalists as well in the 19th century. And it's interesting that we have this strong association with our own church, our founding generation, that will really be the primary focus. We've talked about birds here for a moment coming into the service, into the lecture, and I have this picture here of a red-tailed hawk that I took last summer, and it happens that in May it'll be 50 years since my own personal visit, first time at the cemetery. My mother was an avid birder, and she invited me to join an Audubon walk at Mount Auburn when I was a junior in high school. I didn't know a thing about cemeteries, history. I was not involved in Unitarianism. We did not live in Belmont. So I had no idea how much of interest to our church lay ahead of me in the future. But I fell in love with the place immediately and have been there many, many times over the years. So I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about it. Let's go down one more slide, Mark, and talk a little bit about the roots of how this cemetery came about. The picture on the left will be familiar to all of us, the graveyard at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Harvard Square. And that was typical of New England villages and indeed communities throughout North America and Europe into the late 18th century. But as our society became more urbanized, industrialized, as populations began to boom in our large cities, it really became apparent that it was no longer practical to bury people either in the crypts of churches, under the floorboards, or in the crypts, or in the immediately adjacent graveyards. In fact, it had been the practice in Europe to inter people for a period of time and then take out their remains and reinter a new generation. But at the turn of the 19th century in Paris, the first garden cemetery, Père Lachaise Cemetery, was established in 1804. If you haven't been to see Père Lachaise, it's absolutely spectacular, and it was the inspiration for Mount Auburn. I think a key point is that last bullet point. We saw sort of a change in psychology in our society in the early 19th century, a change from the rationalist Enlightenment era to the Romantic era, new attitudes toward death. Unitarianism really took hold in our country in the early 19th century. And so all of those were factors in bringing about the impetus for this new type of cemetery. So Mark, let's go to the next slide. And we're looking on the right at Dr. Jacob Bigelow, who is credited as being really the founding force behind the cemetery. He was a physician and a botanist, and he was aware of the health and sanitation issues around burials in proximity to churches in urbanized areas. So there had been talk for some time about this lovely site on the edge of Cambridge. It's actually primarily in Watertown with a slice of it in Cambridge. Had been known as Stone's Farm. It was sometimes referred to as Sweet Auburn, a beautiful spot for nature lovers and apparently lovers of other kinds. It was a trysting spot in that era. And the cemetery was founded on 70 acres of land. It's been gradually enlarged over the years to about 170 acres. And it's really served as the inspiration for similar types of cemeteries in virtually every major city in the United States by the mid to late 19th century. So we'll go on to the next slide. Just a handful of pictures to show that this is a beautiful spot in all 4 seasons. I go there every time of year. I most especially love it in the spring. It's just ablaze with color in the spring, but also in the fall. And on a hot summer day under that cool canopy, it's delightful. I wish we saw maybe a little more of the snow we see in the upper left. We haven't had that much in recent years, but in any case, beautiful place to go virtually any time of year. So enjoy it if you have the chance. We'll go on to the next slide. The cemetery has wonderful finding aids. You can pick up a map right at the Egyptian gate on Mount Auburn Street, and a handy tool that I've used a great deal is an iPhone app to locate burials. So I've used that app a great deal in preparation of the tours that we've done. Mark, if you could. There are several notable buildings on the cemetery grounds. In the upper left, you see the sort of early Gothic revival Bigelow Chapel. It's kind of in the style of a French cathedral with stone vaulting. That's been enlarged to facilitate receptions for services just in the last decade or so. The Washington Tower is in the upper right, gives one of the best views of Greater Boston, including views right to downtown as well as out toward Belmont. We're looking in the general direction of, you see the Huron Avenue Tower, and we're looking toward Belmont directly behind the tower. The Egyptian Gate in the lower left is quite a notable structure. This was an era where there was interest in Egyptian art and certainly associations with cemeteries. So that's kind of an intriguing presence. And then the Story Chapel in the lower right, kind of an English country style church, has the church offices, a crematorium, a chapel. So that's right at the gate. That's also a very interesting building. And then we'll go on to the next slide. And the Sphinx, which is a memorial to the Civil War dead from the Union Army, was a gift of Dr. Bigelow soon after the Civil War. And it has become a noted stop on the African-American Heritage Trail through Cambridge. So that's really one of the striking presences. The Sphinx is facing the facade of the Bigelow Chapel, if you haven't seen it. Wonderful stop. Okay, Mark. There are just an endless number of very interesting funerary monuments. I've picked a few that I think are especially notable. We were talking a moment ago about Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, who has sort of a temple-like structure there in the upper left, right at the edge of the pond at the Cambridge corner of the cemetery. Nathaniel Bowditch in the upper right was a mariner, mathematician, and one of the key figures in figuring out the problem of longitude in the early 19th century. And that's one of the very few figurative statues that we see in the cemetery. Likewise, Hosea Ballou in the lower left, who was the minister of the Second Universalist Church. I've been all over the cemetery, and I think these may be the only two statues that depict an actual individual. There are many statues of angels in human forms, and there are dogs and pets, but I think these may be the only two that I've seen. I'd be interested if others have seen other figurative representations. I've included in the lower right one of my favorite spots. That's Teresa pointing at the tablet for Buckminster Fuller, the architect. And Mark, if you go to the next slide, we'll enlarge it. He, of course, is famous for popularizing the concept of the geodesic dome. And so we see the engraving of a geodesic dome there. And I include this because some of the most interesting monuments are not necessarily the largest. If you wander through the cemetery here and there, you'll just see some of the most intriguing things, and you'll come across names that you might have had no expectation of seeing. It happens that Buckminster Fuller was the grandnephew of Margaret Fuller, the great transcendentalist and Unitarian, who I will have a picture coming up here of her cenotaph. So if we could move on, Mark. Actually, it'll be in a couple of slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through an exhaustive list of famous people buried, but they come in a variety of, I mean, really all walks of life. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the upper left, one of our nation's great poets. So you'll find any number of poets, authors, and literary figures. In the upper right is the tomb of Senator Charles Sumner, the great abolitionist who was so severely beaten on the floor of the Senate chamber after one of his passionate speeches. And there are a great many political figures, members of Congress, probably 5 or 6 Massachusetts governors. So a lot of political figures at the cemetery. In the lower left, you see the obelisk there, which is the gravesite of the Supreme Court Justice Story, who happened to have been the first president of the cemetery. And I believe there are 4 Supreme Court justices, US Supreme Court justices at Mount Auburn, as well as a Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. There are, I think, 7 Harvard University presidents, including all of the presidents since Eliot right after the Civil War. I believe, let's see, Charles Tufts, who donated the land for Tufts University. So obviously being in proximity to Boston, the Boston area's great universities, many leading academic figures. And then in the lower right, we see the gravestones for Samuel Gridley Howe and Julia Ward Howe, who were husband and wife. buried together serenely. They had sort of a rocky marriage, we understand, but they seem to cohabitate peaceably next to each other in the cemetery today. It looks like Julia wins the cairn stone count with all the stones that visitors have left on her grave site. The Howes are no relation to me, but I'm interested certainly in her her magnificent contributions, author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Samuel Gridley Howe, the founder and leader of the Perkins School for the Blind, both notable Unitarian social reformers. We'll go to the next slide, please, Mark. And this is Margaret Fuller's cenotaph. You will recall she was lost at sea off Long Island on her return voyage from Italy right around 1850. Her infant son's body was recovered and is buried in the cemetery. But a cenotaph is used when there is not a body to bury. Another notable cenotaph at Mount Auburn is for Robert Gould Shaw, the leader of the Massachusetts 54th that led the assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, that was the basis for the film Glory. And then on the right side, we see the Homer family. This is one of the Homer family's grave sites. This is the family of the artist Winslow Homer, whose marker is in the upper right corner. The Homers have a lot of associations with Belmont, and we'll be talking about them more as we move into the presentation. So Mark, we can go on from here. I mentioned the many associations with Unitarianism and Universalism. So really our church's two, I would say, among primary sources of Unitarianism and Universalism in America, we have William Ellery Channing, who led the Federal Street Church, now the Arlington Street Church in Boston, and is really seen as the leading figure of American Unitarianism in the early 19th century. John Murray came to America in 1770 from England as a Universalist preacher. Again, shipwrecked, landed off of New Jersey and came ashore and began preaching. I certainly will not forget the wonderful sermon that Edmund Robinson gave about Murray's life about 15 years ago at First Church. Give them hope, not hell. And this is his marker, a wonderful grave site. He was actually reinterred at Mount Auburn because he died in around 15 or 20, sometime in that period. The cemetery did not open until 1831. So there are a number of interments bodies that had been buried elsewhere and were brought to the cemetery after it opened. In fact, I have a fifth generation grandfather who's buried not far from Washington Tower that I was interested to discover about a decade ago. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Obviously, for all these reasons, Mount Auburn attracts people with historical interests. I was doing a walkthrough in preparation for a walking tour last May and encountered this group of UUs from the Hingham Church. They were visiting John Murray's gravesite, and I made a couple of new friends there and tagged along with them for half an hour. And it's a wonderful way to learn a bit about history as well as about the cemetery. And if we go to the next site, we will see a picture of some of our own youth. And that's Eva Patalis next to the marker. And you see Cora McCold right behind the marker for Reverend Charles Torrey, a Congregationalist preacher and abolitionist. This is one of the most remarkable memorials in the entire cemetery, I think. He was a very courageous abolitionist who ended up dying in a prison in Baltimore, having gone back and forth. I think he was personally responsible for liberating nearly 400 enslaved people, far beyond the number that Harriet Tubman is credited with bringing back across the Mason-Dixon line. So I had a typo here. This was November of 22 years ago. But I was delighted to introduce these young people to the cemetery, and hope we can do this again in the future. So moving on, we're now really going to shift to where I think our group's interest is, and that is the connections between our church and Mount Auburn. To do this, I'm going to begin by sharing this map of what Belmont looked like in the mid-19th century. You may have seen this map. There are 14 names of some of the large landholders and farmers in town. It happens that 6 of them were associated with our church. And perhaps the critical feature of this map, you see the dotted line depicting the Fitchburg Railroad. I would say it was the Fitchburg Railroad extension that went beyond Fresh Pond to Waltham in the mid-1840s that really gave the impetus for the founding of our town. I think before then, the land that our town is on was, there were parts in West Cambridge, or now Arlington. There were parts in Watertown and a small part in the Northwest there, I guess the western section that was part of Waltham. They were all assembled and our town founded in 1859 by as the historians say, a determined group of fighters. And we're going to meet some of these people who were really very energetically pursued the creation of the town of Belmont in 1859. So let's go to the next slide if we could. I want to give a nod of acknowledgement to the Belmont Historical Society, which Victoria Haas, many of you may have seen this book, which came out about 20 years ago. It has some wonderful pictures, and these are the sources of some of the only photos that I've seen of many of our town's early leaders. We see a total 5 and 5, 10 people. 9 out of the 10 had connections with our church. Only, I think that's Mansur Marsh in the lower left, was not associated with the so-called Belmont Congregational Society, as we were known at our founding. And we'll be meeting several of these men, all men, and in some cases, some of their wives and children as we go through. So Mark, you can advance it. Here we're looking at 2 pages from our church's record books. These are the big leather-bound volumes in the history bookcase in the conference room that were meticulously transcribed under the direction of Amos Taylor, our church clerk in the mid-20th century. So there's probably 25 names, actually, no, probably closer to 40 names, to 2 columns. But there are many recurring surnames. And on the left in that column, beginning with Hammett, Hill, Hittinger, I've listed some of the prominent names of first generation members of the church who are interred at the cemetery. And also toward the bottom, you see Atkins, Chenery, and Fletcher, 3 other notable names. So I'll be addressing who some of these people were as we go forward. So we can go to the next slide and meet the probably the single figure most responsible for the creation of the town and the church. This is Samuel Meade, who was a justice of the peace and really led the efforts to incorporate the town. He was married to the daughter of a Wellington. The Wellingtons had been for 200 years or more prominent family in the Belmont area, or what was then West Cambridge. Jedithan Wellington was a veteran of the American Revolution and the proprietor of Wellington's Tavern, a very important spot on the road from Boston to Concord at the base of Belmont Hill. And when folks would come out on the Concord Turnpike to go out that way, he would often meet them, and his team of oxen would haul their wagons up the hill to get to on their way out to Concord. He was a stockbroker, and he was the man who initially built the Underwood house that stands behind the library. And so it was at first the Mead home, and then became, as I think it's known in town, as the first Underwood house and part of the Underwood estate. So a splendid tomb here, and we're actually going to see several other members that were related to Mead as we go forward. Okay, Mark, we can jump to the other most important figure at the foundation of the church was our first minister. You can read about him on the tablet on the west wall of the church. He was a much beloved figure in the history of the church, which wasn't always the case. We didn't always have easy relations with our ministers in that first half century, but Amos Smith was remembered very fondly. And if you go forward, we're going to look at the inscriptions on these two stones in the next slide, Mark. So for Amos, it reads, "To Amos Smith, who left behind the living beauty of that Christian faith, which was his strength and now is his reward." Note that he died in 1887. He born in 16. His wife, Mary Elizabeth, apparently was not only 8 years older than he, but also survived him by 17 years. So she was in town for a good long time, lived to age 96. And so they lived on Pleasant Street for many years after his pastorate. And he was well regarded in town. Evidently went quite deaf toward the end of his life, but people were still very fond of him. So a very familiar face. You've seen that face in our church, I'm sure, many times. If we go to the next slide, here's a very impressive engraving from a history of Middlesex County of Jacob Hittinger, a familiar name in the town. And that tablet there, bronze tablet or copper, I'm not sure what it is. Jacob Hittinger is actually regarded as sort of the patriarch of the Hittinger clan. Early on in his life, he was in the ice business, cutting ice on Fresh Pond, or was a big business. We shipped ice to Caribbean ports and elsewhere before modern refrigeration. And then he became prominent in the market gardening business. In fact, Belmont was one of the key market garden sources of food for Greater Boston in the late 19th, early 20th century. On the grounds of Hittinger Farms, at one point, there was a greenhouse that was 2 football fields long, 600 and something feet long. It was the biggest greenhouse in the entire United States. But that enterprise gradually gave way to real estate development and was finally done in the hurricane in 1938, which destroyed many of the last of the great greenhouses. Hittinger, a notable story about him is that in about 1843 or 44, when he was in the ice cutting business, there was a Cunard steamship that had come over from Britain that got trapped in Boston Harbor when the harbor froze over. And evidently it was Hittinger who led the way, went out and actually cut the ice out, starting not at the shore, but at the dangerous edge of the ice, and freed this steamship. So he established a reputation as a forceful, brutally strong man in the 40s, and was one of the very energetic allies of Meade in creating the town, and served as a selectman in the mid 1850s, end of the 1850s, 1860s. Okay, Mark, we'll go on to look at Oliver Wellington. This is a grandson of the colonel, who I mentioned before, and the first chairman of our board of assessors. Also involved in the church, not in a leadership capacity, but I think he was a parish committee member for several years. And we're going to see the twin gravestone. He died in 1876, and his wife survived him by a couple of decades. If we look at the next slide, we'll see Sarah Wellington, who was from the Hill family, West Cambridge or Arlington family. And you'll see there's a map there. This is an enlargement in the lower right that shows Pleasant Street running sort of diagonally in the sort of 2 o'clock direction out of the town center. And you'll see that the Wellingtons were right there, not terribly far from the William F. Homer House that's now the Women's Club of Belmont. If you'll see on this map, the Unitarian Church is between Concord Avenue and the Fitchburg line. That would be the original 1857 church. And apparently the parsonage was across the street. I think the parsonage was a house, probably almost a twin to the Johnson house, but it was sited on what's now the driveway that leads into the parsonage. I think it's a parsonage for the Armenian church a couple of doors down from us. So as you go down Concord Avenue past the Johnson house, there's that large open parking area. I think that's where our parsonage sat at that time. And we struggled with funding it. So there was a later parsonage on Horace Road, but that apparently is where the minister lived originally. Okay, we'll go to the next slide and meet their daughter, Mary Frances Wellington Homer. So you see she was derived from the Wellington family, or her forebears were from the Wellington and Hill families, and she married into the Homer family. She married Oliver Mead Homer, who was the son of William F. Homer's brother, Eleazar Homer. So this is a small town, and you see there's a lot of intermarriage going on among these leading families in town. Mary had an interesting and somewhat tragic life. She lost her father, her husband, and her older son, all in the space of a very few years. We saw that her father died in 1876. Her husband was only 31 when he had a case of, I think it was peritonitis, and he died. And then very tragically, two boys. The older boy was killed by a train in Belmont Center, right at the crossing. So she was just left with her younger son, also named Eleazar. She turned and devoted her energies to the suffragist cause. She was a leading suffragist in the town of Belmont, also involved in lobbying the Massachusetts legislature, and later in life moved to Rhode Island. I read it stated that she was the first woman to vote in local elections in Belmont. So I would not say she was a top leader, but she was certainly a key foot soldier in the suffragist movement in the 1880s. And we'll be alluding to the expansion of women's rights later in the presentation. Her son, Eleazar, is well remembered in Belmont, a prominent architect of what's now known as the Homer Building, had been originally the high school. This is the town hall annex. Many of you will remember the Tudor block, considered the most beautiful building in Belmont. It was unfortunately torn down and made way for the Belmont Savings Bank building. It's now, I forget, M&T, whatever it's called these days, and the Butler School in the Waverly neighborhood. One thing I also wanted to note was, if you look at that picture in the upper right, you see some of this is out on the Mead. We're facing the Samuel Mead tombstone, and or that almost temple-like crypt. And you'll see that there are 3 large stones, and then on the left, a smaller, more modern stone that is Mary Frances Wellington Homer's stone. So there was certainly a change in styles that took place, and I think you'll see that as we go more into the modern era, or if you visit the cemetery. Okay, Mark, we can jump forward from here. Now this is a mystery that I hope to unravel. We've mentioned the name Underwood. William, the Underwood family, prominent in town, associated with canning. And here is one of the key figures in that family. William J. Underwood was the first head of the Board of Trustees of our library. And he married the daughter of Samuel Mead, who we mentioned a few slides back. And then he and his wife, Samuel's daughter, moved into the Mead home, and thereafter it really became known as the Underwood House, or part of the large Underwood estate in this corner of Belmont. The surprising thing, in my view, is he is not buried at Mount Auburn. And he's the only person I'm mentioning here who isn't. There are a great many Underwoods found at Mount Auburn, and his wife is actually buried in her parents' tomb. But William is across town at Forest Hills Cemetery in Boston. And I am pretty curious to figure out how that came about. Yeah. So you'll see that the picture is out of the book. That bas-relief on the right, many of you may have passed in the Belmont Public Library. So have a look for it next time you're there. It's if you go in the main entrance, it's down on the left. Okay, Mark, we can jump forward. Now here's a character, Samuel Hammett, who served as our town's first clerk. And also he was chairman of the building committee, finance committee, to raise money for our first 1857 church building. That was the rather simple so-called Carpenter Gothic building wedged between Concord Avenue and the railroad that only lasted about 30 plus years, about 33 years, and then burned down. Charlie Hammond has suggested to me that it was sparks flying off of the back of a train that reached the church and set it ablaze in early 1890. Fortunately, just as we were completing construction on our beautiful new 1890 sanctuary. What's interesting about Samuel Hammett and his wife Maria is he's one of the few early members who didn't live out their lives in Belmont. He's actually resigned membership, and they moved to Newton in the 1870s. I don't know the reason why. I think he was, his profession was as an accountant or bookkeeper. I don't know if he had a change in circumstances or whatever, but this is another one of our early leaders' sites. So we'll go on to the next slide and meet one of the town's most prominent early political figures, Barnum Fletcher, who lived in a grand house right close to the Homers, was a selectman in town. He was a state legislator, he was a member of the legislature, and also later on served a term as the first state senator elected from the new town of Belmont. So quite a prominent figure in town, both in Belmont as well as in the city of Boston. He had offices in Faneuil Hall. He was a wholesale beef merchant. Associations with beef may relate to the fact that he was a neighbor of the Chenery family, and we'll be talking about Winthrop Chenery and the Highland Stock Farm and Belmont's role in introducing Holstein cattle to the United States. He was a banker. There was a bank known as the Faneuil Hall National Bank, in which he was, I think, president, certainly senior leader, and also he was a senior leader of the Belmont Savings Bank when it was founded. Very generous to the church, very generous to Belmont, and also generous to his own hometown of Westford. The story is he actually walked from Westford to Belmont, and he married a local girl. Her name was Marcy Ann Hill from the Hill family. We don't have a picture of her, but if we go to the next slide, Mark, you'll all recognize this beautiful window from the west wall of our church, given in memory of Marcy Ann, the wife of J.V. Fletcher. So I would love to find a picture of Marcy Ann. It's disappointing to me how few photographs. Occasionally we see painted images in the case of wealthy families, but in the early days of photography, it's sort of unpredictable who's going to have a photo and who isn't. And I'm always on the hunt to turn up new photos. So if we can come across a photo of Marcy Ann Hill or Marcy Ann Fletcher, I'd love to add it to our archive. Okay, we'll go to the next slide and meet Jonas Chenery. We've seen some impressive looking facial hair in this presentation, but this one is, to me, he gets the Unfrozen Caveman Award. It's quite a look he's got there. Jonas was from the famous Chenery family, which had a very prominent presence in Belmont for well more than a century. But I don't know terribly much more about him than that he was on the first board of selectmen of Belmont in the mid 1860s. But we do know a good deal about the Chenery family. I mentioned that Winthrop, and I still haven't pinned down the relationship, was responsible for introducing the first herd of Holstein cattle, who were brought to America, a small herd, and later propagated, and the Holstein cattle became very common in the western ranching regions of the country late in the century. It was Winthrop W.'s grandson, Winthrop L., who was the chairman of our town school committee, and for whom the Chenery Middle School is named. So the name Chenery lived on in Belmont for more than half a century after the founding of the church. We're looking at the bottom right, that page 102 is from our late 19th, early 20th century member book. And we see half a dozen Chenerys, but after the teens, really by the 1920s, the name Chenery disappears from the church's records. Okay, Mark, we can go on to, now we'll meet William F. Homer. I've mentioned him before a couple of times. This was another uncle of the artist Winslow Homer. And interestingly, William and his brother Eleazar, they both married two sisters from the Wellington family. So the relationships really do get quite complicated. We had the case of Maria, was it Maria, who married her first cousin once removed. So there really is a dense web of connections. William F. Homer was a wealthy Boston merchant. That image on the right is from a late 19th century Boston newspaper, and it depicts his premises on Union Street, which if you go down to the Union Oyster House right down near Faneuil Hall, that's where he would have been located. I haven't been there to see if the actual building is still standing because the area's gone through a great deal of redevelopment. But William and his wife Adeline are buried here at this site. And why don't we meet her, Mark, if we could flip to the next slide. A picture of her does survive and is in the Belmont Historical Society's books. What I found interesting here is I think they misspelled her name on the gravestone. Every other time I've seen the name Adeline, it's with an E. But in any event, this was the mistress of the house at that grand house at the corner of Concord Avenue that is now the Belmont Women's Club. And that was the home where young Winslow would often repair when he came out to Belmont, as he did a great deal in his teens and 20s.
You know where the
So-
women is?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, why don't we jump forward if we could? We're going to meet a couple of brothers for whom we don't have pictures, Frank and Charles Yates. Instead, I've drawn this image, which is the mural on the wall of the Belmont Historical Society's Claflin room in the town library. Get there before September, because I don't know what's going to happen to this mural. I hope that they figure out a way to preserve it and move it, because there are two murals in that room that they're certainly idealized and romanticized, but I think they're interesting historical depictions of what our town looked like in the mid-19th century. You see the Wellington Tavern there on the left, that's more or less on the site of where the town hall sits right now, or the Homer building, the annex. And then on the lower right, right at the edge of the picture, that's the old Adams General Store. And that site is where the Belmont Municipal Light Plant with the substation is now located there, right by the railroad tracks. And then you see in the middle the train and the Wellington Station that now sits right outside our door, and the stagecoach coming up Concord Avenue toward the hill. So the Adams General Store would have been where Charles worked as a grocer. Frank was our church parish clerk and also the organist. His brother Charles was a chorister. And if we look at the next slide, Mark, we're going to see their tombstones side by side. And I've included both tombstones, and you'll note that both of them married women named Mary Elizabeth and Mary Louise. Well, it happens that one of these Marys was known as Minnie and was our soprano soloist for 15 years. So I don't know which one. I don't know that we'll ever know which one, because the records on this group are fairly thin. But I thought it was interesting to see. You'll see that Frank there died at age 34. So he was the organist, and don't know how he met his end so early. But that's an interesting pair. And now we're getting toward the bottom of the list. I have a couple of other interesting individuals that we want to meet. Here is one of the most important but mysterious figures in our church's history. Maria Livermore was from a family of 6 children. I think there are no survivors. Few, if any of them, even got married, but the Livermore family had a farm in the south side of town that had been part of Watertown. They were active members of the Watertown Church, but after the formation of the town of Belmont, the family saw the writing on the wall. They shifted their allegiance from Watertown to Belmont. And Maria, although not admitted as a member of the church, was a very devoted and energetic volunteer. She served for 8 years as our treasurer, even before she was enrolled as a member, which happened in 1883. And later in her life, when she was in her late 60s or around 70, she was invited by our minister to be an alternate delegate to the National Unitarian Convention. But she gave a great deal of her time, as I said, without even being a member. And we have, because she never married, never had children, I don't know if we'll be able to learn anything more about her, but there are just a couple of tantalizing clues in our records. I want to look at the next page, next slide. And here's some notes from our 1883 parish committee minutes. The loss of your lady treasurer would be little less than a calamity, and your parish committee know, for she has done nearly all the work. And yet we are assured we shall lose her if your financial affairs are not put on a more dignified basis. Well, I think that Maria probably, after giving all these years of service to the church, may have been feeling a little fed up for not getting recognized and not even being afforded membership in the church. And it was right around this time, by a vote of the existing all-male parish committee, that she, not only was she admitted, but immediately a group of 9 women were admitted as members. And at the next meeting of the parish committee, another 6 women were admitted as members. So this was sort of the bursting open of the floodgates of affording women a formal voting role as full members of the church, rather than being basically appended to their husbands. And this was this very same era in which I mentioned our Maria Homer, the suffragist, who was agitating to advance voting rights for women in town and at the state level in the very same era. So I think this is a tantalizing clue to what Maria might have been experiencing at the church. I would love to learn more about her, and I'm not sure how that will be possible, but continue to be on the lookout for more information. Okay, Mark, we are coming toward the end. I think the last couple of slides, we're going to be talking about a very important family in our church, the Atkins family. And we'll be learning a lot more about the Atkins family in the coming weeks, I hope. Alicia Atkins is a familiar name, commemorated in the Tiffany window in the chancel of our church. He was a child of Cape Cod, Truro, Cape Cod, his family came to Boston when he was 5 years old, and he was educated at Roxbury Latin School. And when his family left to go to New York, he, at age 18, struck out on his own and launched a very successful career in the sugar trade. So he was involved as not only in shipping, as his father had been, but actually as a merchant, buying and selling sugar cargoes and really developing the sugar trade to the point that he was the largest merchant in the Boston market, which was one of the largest markets in North America. He turned over leadership in that enterprise to his own son, Edwin, and we'll be learning a bit more about Edwin in the upcoming program I'll mention. And toward the end of Alicia's career, the last 10 or 20 years, he was much more focused on 2 other fields. One was building the country was in a railroad building phase, and he was very involved in building a railroad in Arkansas. But also, this was a time that the South Boston waterfront was being redeveloped. You know, that had been essentially a lot of mud flats, and it was filled, and it became, Fan Pier was a important railroad pier by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, before it was later redeveloped into the modern sort of generic looking urban landscape that we see today. So Alicia was a very energetic, really a leading regional figure in many ways of national importance. I've heard it said that the image of the pilgrim in our window may depict him in his younger years. I don't know if we'll ever see enough other pictures to really determine if that image was taken from life or from another picture of Alicia. But his gravesite is there. And why don't we look at one more slide of a church member, his wife, Mary. shown here with their infant son, Edwin. And Mary Freeman was from another Cape Cod family. And they lived in Boston, Pemberton Square. And later they moved to Commonwealth Avenue. And Belmont was their summer home. They came out and started renting in Belmont in 1857. And they never, during Alicia's lifetime, they never had full-time residence in Belmont. However, their son, Edwin, did marry in our church in 1882 to Catherine Risley, who we'll be talking about not this morning, but in the upcoming program. And the Atkins family would have continued to have a very prominent role in our church and in our town in the following decades. If you visit the Atkins gravesite, it's quite a poignant sight. You see the statue showing the three small children. In fact, Mary lost her first three babies, and Edwin, the fourth, lived to adulthood and had several children. Really, Edwin is really the connection between Alicia and the later generations of the Atkins family. Mary and Alicia had a daughter who died in childbirth, or died very soon after, a few days after giving birth, and she and her infant are also buried at this site. So it's it's an impressive memorial, but obviously there was a good deal of tragedy associated with their lives. And it is said that the death of his daughter was part of what brought about Alicia's demise. I think she was 1887 or 6, and he died in 1888. So that must have been a blow for him. So if you get to the cemetery, do find this site. I can certainly provide pointers. It's quite an impressive and poignant memorial. So I just have one final image that I want to share with you all. This is actually from Google Earth. You see in the bottom of the image, that's the Payson Park Reservoir. So this is, imagine you're hovering more or less above our church, looking toward downtown Boston. And you see how developed our region has become over the last 150 years since the establishment of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And yet there in the middle is this large 170-acre refuge, this quiet place of repose and rest and beauty, right smack in the middle of this very busy, bustling area. And I have come to view Mount Auburn not just as a place for the dead. Importantly, it is a place for the living. It's a place for us to rest ourselves, to sort of experience the beauty of the natural world, to learn about history, to learn about our connections with our past. And I think we as a church are very fortunate that this is a place where we can learn, I think, a good deal about the forebears who really established our church in its beginning era, and to whom we owe a great deal. So that's the end of the presentation. I don't know how many questions I can answer, but if there may be topics for research, but if the talk has stimulated questions, I'd be pleased to hear them.
Well, that was wonderful, just really interesting. And we appreciate you really are knowledgeable about people, places, history in the cemetery. I unfortunately have to leave early. I'm just telling people that now, but would others like to ask questions? I'm sure they would.
John, have you talked to Meg Winslow, who runs the historic records in the archives at Mount Auburn, about any
No.
particular Livermore? Yeah, well, she's a font of information. She's fabulous.
Meg
Meg Winslow. It's like Winslow Homer.
Yeah, okay.
And the interesting thing about, they also have, each of the burials have burial cards.
Mhm.
And I'm curious to know what the burial card says for Adeline, that misspelling. I'd be curious to know whether or not they're aware. I'm sure if next time if I see Meg, to inquire about that, but every burial has a card, and they actually sometimes get archival information, archives, donated to the cemetery. And so there might be some archival information to be retrieved from Meg. There's always the New England Historical Society, but she has connections, with all those groups.
Right.
But yeah, touch base, with Meg and see whether or not you can get anything more.
Will do. That's a great tip. Thanks, Gene.
Yeah, maybe the burial cards for the two Marys might say if one of them was also known as Minnie.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you very much. It was really
Yeah.
wonderful.
Oh.
And we had taken to go to the cemetery just for the purpose you mentioned last. And I find it very restful, but so beautiful in all seasons. And I am amazed at some of the newer designs that have taken place over the years. And it's just very beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for presenting this view, and it's so well researched. I'm really grateful.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicole.
Could I ask a question?
Sure can.
Okay, I noticed on several of the gravestones, just a second, let me ignore it. The stones are placed, and I'm interested in what the significance of this tradition is in Unitarianism or in Christianity, because there is the same tradition in Judaism, and I'm wondering if it's the same or it's developed or what.
Oh, you mean the small stones?
Small stones that visitors leave.
Yeah. And I think that may have become more popular in recent years. I first became aware of that practice when I was out in high school visiting Walden Pond at the Thoreau's,
Yeah.
the site of Thoreau's cabin. And is it called a cairn when stones are piled up? I mean, sometimes they're piled up as markers on a path. I don't know when the tradition originated. I don't know if it's in fact much more popular today than it was 50 or 100 years ago, but I definitely I see it often these days.
I didn't know it did.
I
I
could
had
speak to
never
it.
seen it in France. Christians bring flowers and Jews put stones. So I don't know. And I was very surprised too. I don't know.
Well, the stones probably last longer.
Absolutely. I could speak to that. In Judaism, the stones for centuries, the stones were placed not on all graves, but only on the graves of famous teachers, rabbis, and so forth by visitors to acknowledge that they have visited this very famous and worthy person.
Yeah.
But over the years, it developed when people said, well, my Uncle Moses should have been famous because he was a very good man. So they would come and leave a stone, and that just blossomed out. So it became universal. Anytime you visited a grave, you brought a stone and placed it.
Yeah.
Nicole, did you want to close the meeting out now that Pat's left?
Okay, well, before we leave, again, I want to thank you a lot. And I'd like to invite you to join me at the next meeting that we will have in March.
Mhm.
And we'll see places in Paris. Some of them I didn't even know existed. And Kenneth has been kind enough over when we went last time to walk with me and find some of these places. And where we didn't know, our son Mark helped us. So I hope you'll join us, but I can't promise it will be as good as what John did. That I have to warn you about. But thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.